It's my pleasure to kick off the keynote speech with the Ambassador Jacqueline O'Neill. Before I do so, I'd like to introduce the two other participants in this session. The Dean of the Faculty of Public Affairs, Dr. Brenda O'Neill, will be introducing the Ambassador. Dr. O'Neill was appointed over the summer during the pandemic. She just started on October 1st. So this is part of our initiation or hazing process to have her participate in our effort. She also holds a position as professor in the Department of Political Science. Her research addresses a lot of different issues, including political behavior and gender and politics, focusing on mostly on Canada. Her recent research has examined gender and party leadership and the role of feminist identification in shaping support for sovereignty among women in Quebec. It's funny because during the session, a few minutes ago, we were talking about Quebec and poutine and how late I was to come to it. But anyway, she's won several Sherk grants and recently held the Thelma Margaret Hort Fellowship in Women in Society at the University of Calgary. She also was the editor, one of the editors of Canadian Journal of Political Science. And she comes to us after having served as the department head of political science at the University of Calgary. And the moderator for the session is Beth Woroniuk, and she is the coordinator for the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada in Ottawa. She holds degrees from in economics and political science from the University of Toronto. She's worked with the UN and a multitude of NGOs to advance gender equality and women's rights. And her expertise focuses on conflict resolution, peace building, and sexual violence and conflict. So I'm going to hand it over to Beth to have a conversation with Ambassador Jacqueline O'Neill. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Steve. Ambassador, we're so glad to have you with us today. We understand that you have had an early start, given your different conversations around the world. I'd like to first, though, note that we're joining this conversation today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I offer this as an acknowledgement of the debt we owe to the generations who have come before us, and as a symbol of the importance of reconciliation between the Indigenous people who lived on these lands for hundreds of years and the settler communities who arrived more recently. Je suis très heureuse d'être ici aujourd'hui.
I am very happy to be here today and to have this conversation with our Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security. Most of this session will take place in English, but we have simultaneous interpretation, and the questions are welcome in either one of the official languages.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Beth, and thanks to the CDSN, the CSIDS, and NIPSIA, and all others for having us here. And I know we wanted to have a video as well from Dean O'Neill, so maybe we can go to that before we jump into our conversation.
Thank you, Professor Seidman, and welcome everyone. On behalf of Carleton University, the Faculty of Public Affairs, the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, and the Center for Security, Intelligence and Defense Studies.
We're missing the sound,
I'm honored to introduce to you today Canada's first Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security, Jacqueline O'Neill, who's the keynote speaker for today's 2021 Year Ahead Conference. Ambassador O'Neill has a bachelor's degree in commerce from the University of Alberta and a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University.
No problem. Sure. I should make clear, Dean O'Neill is no relation to me, so my throwing it to her was not a reflection of nepotism or anything along those lines. Not that there would be reason to think that, but these days we can't be too careful. So maybe we'll get back to her if it works out later, but thanks, Beth.
Great, thanks, Jackie. You're the ambassador for Women, Peace and Security, and those three words sort of roll off the tongue as if they're all one word. And we hear that or most people know that there are some very common elements to this agenda. Talk of increasing women in peacekeeping or addressing sexual harassment inside security institutions. But we know that the agenda is much broader than counting the number of women. So what we thought we'd start with was sort of a speed women, peace, and security exercise. Instead of asking Jackie to give us the long explanation of what is the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, I'm going to throw out a few terms, a few issues, and I'd like Jackie to tell us in just a couple of sentences why a lens of women, peace, and security, or why the women, peace, and security is relevant to this term. So, are you game, Jackie?
I'm game. Thanks.
Great. Okay. The first term is cybersecurity.
Okay, so a big aspect of cybersecurity, of course, is data privacy. And one risk that a lot of people have identified is the weaponization of medical records. So when hospitals or clinics undergo cyber attacks and data breaches, one thing that can be targeted are records related to, for example, reproductive health services. And in many countries, a lot of those services are illegal, and in most, they're at minimum stigmatized. So women who have access to care can be vulnerable to blackmail or consequences. And of course, some sexual minorities who've received health treatments can face prosecution or death. Cybersecurity.
Great.
Is that what you want, Beth? Something short?
Exactly. That's perfect. This is just give us the elevator pitch or even one aspect of why it's relevant. So here's actually, this one's a tough one. Chemical weapons. Why is this? What do we gain when we look at this from a women, peace, and security perspective?
As always, a lot. So chemical weapons, there's research about variations in levels of susceptibility between men and women to different toxic agents. So some are more or less deadly depending on your biological sex. And some toxic agents can result in reproductive health problems like miscarriages or infertility, many of which are rarely tracked or identified. So that's one side, and really quickly, another side is that, in many parts of the world, culturally, women are still primarily responsible for cleaning up infected sites and for handling sick people as well as dead bodies. And so that makes it really essential that when people are planning emergency management instructions or protocols about how to deal with people who've been exposed to chemical weapons, they need to be reaching women, not just men in populations as well.
I'm hearing echoes there of some of what we heard about the Ebola crisis and some of the gender dimensions of dealing with the Ebola pandemic. Great, thanks. Another topic that's been in the news, returning foreign fighters.
Sure. Steve and Stephanie had a great episode of their podcast about this one. So 1 in 5 fighters who left North America and Europe to join ISIS were women. So that's 20%. So as we're talking about returning, are 1 in 5 returnees women? Are they being monitored in the same way? What roles are unhelpful stereotypes about women's lack of agency playing in the ways that women are prosecuted? And are women themselves deliberately exploiting those stereotypes to get more lenient sentences, for example, which is something we've already started to see?
Okay, I'm starting to get some insights here that this is not something that we can portion off to a separate discussion, but okay, let's go to some other international relations issues like the rise of China. What do we have to look for here?
So the rise of China has had a huge influence on women, peace, and security around the world, and this is, in very broad conceptual ways, and this picks up on what the panel this morning talked about. So the model through which China has increased its global influence involves using economic leverage to provide and to gain support from governments. As Dr. Murphy this morning emphasized, it's often done with a real focus on state sovereignty. And so that appeals particularly to aid recipient governments, and especially in post-conflict settings, who resent and reject conditionalities, such as progress towards democratic development or reduced corruption or environmental impact assessments, for example. So what those types of conditionalities have included have often been really valuable hooks or tools, especially for women in civil society in many of those countries, to advocate to their own governments and to provoke change and to hold their own governments accountable. So a lot of entry points that have traditionally been used by advocates internally have been eroded, in part due to the rise of China.
So lots of implications in different parts of the world as well. Here's one for our colleagues in the Canadian Armed Forces, defense procurement and acquisition.
So many ways. This is one of my favorite ones. So basic example, in Canadian fighter jets, the ejection seat doesn't work if you weigh less than 140 pounds. So we've opened up all roles to women and are encouraging them to enter non-traditional fields, but the design of the plane might have an inadvertent effect of eliminating a relatively small proportion of men and a many times larger proportion of women. So through procurement, we can ask the question, can that be avoided? Same with all kinds of other pieces of equipment.
Sure, I've heard from women in the Canadian Forces even about the basic backpack that that doesn't suit. That she said the staff at Mountain Equipment Co-op understand her needs better than the Armed Forces did. So it's lots of different examples. The very last one, COVID-19. Let's take the word of 2020 and see why. What's your take on that?
So that's obviously a huge one. I've been impressed this year. We actually are hearing a good amount of gender dimensions of it in Canada. A lot of ones we know, including increase in domestic violence everywhere, certainly in Canada as well. I'll give you one kind of different example on this. So 9 out of 10 kids around the world right now are out of school, and we're already seeing increased recruitment of boys and girls into violent extremist groups. So very much a peace and security issue. We also know that girls are going to be a lot less likely than boys to return to school. So there are going to be generational impacts of that on the economy alone, on the pipeline of women and girls who are entering all kinds of professions. And we know, I think it was UNFPA talked about there being an additional, I think, 13 million cases of early and child forced marriages because of COVID, because families are in such dire economic straits that they're looking at marrying off a child in order to get the dowry, which will get them through this basic minimum time. So there's massive kind of secondary and tertiary effects from the pandemic that relate to gender and to security and have differential impacts for different genders.
And as you're saying, that we're going to be seeing for a long time to come. That's great. I'm hoping that gives people a little bit of a flavor of the whole range and diversity of issues that we're talking about when we are talking about women, peace, and security. And so that brings me to the next question. You were appointed about 1.5 years ago. We've just illustrated how wide and broad the women, peace, and security agenda is. Can you tell us a bit about what you've been working on for the last 1.5 years? It sounds like everything under the sun could fall under your mandate. What's been your focus? What have you been trying to achieve since you've been appointed?
Sure. Et je vais peut-être répondre en français.
And I might answer this one in French.
Et,
We are in Canada, so I will answer this one in French. When I got this position, the civil society told me that it was extremely important for me not to waste all your time outside of the country, always talking about how wonderful is Canada. Please work in Canada also. And so I spent some time to enhance the capacities of the Canadian government so that it can hold and respect its commitments at term with the government. So we have to take national actions on women, peace, and security. It's like our polar star, it's our North Star, and a lot of things are done around that. So this involves supporting coordination of all 9 partners. We have 8 departments plus the RCMP, which are our partners, and we want to support people who work on women and security. which have regular meetings. For the first time, we meet on a regular basis. For the first time, we have those meetings this year. And we also have a coordination of things that are very much present. There are several parts of the government which offer violence prevention training session and prevention of violent extremism. And this is distributed across various departments. So we work a lot better if we work together now, I think. We also try to make sure that people have good tools and good frameworks and support so that they can do what they're asked to do. And we should not make assumptions. Just because you believe in gender equality, a majority of people do believe in gender equality, you have to know how to do a comparative gender analysis between sexes and the impact of a coup d'etat, or how to structure an inclusive national dialogue. It's not obvious how to do these things. And also, we have to make sure that we do intersectoral reviews to make sure that we don't see all women as being a homogeneous group, but examine the roles and other factors that can play a role significantly. We also have to maintain strong relations with outside communities, including civil society, the academia, etc., and reinforce the relevance of the Women, Peace and Security program in all fields, as we just did.
Internally, and I'll say really briefly, the second part has been about seizing the momentum of the 20th anniversary of what we call the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So 20 years ago, when Canada was last on the Security Council and we were promoting human security, which we talked about last session, we supported Namibia and Bangladesh and Jamaica to pass this foundational resolution on women, peace, and security. And since then, there have been 9 additional resolutions and a fair amount of action. Consensus generally is that there's been progress, but not nearly enough, and that what there has been vulnerable or not guaranteed. And so I think we'd hope to spend a lot of this year closing some of those gaps. So for example, through the ELSI initiative for women in peace operations and increasing from what is now 6% of uniformed military peacekeepers who are women to a much more reasonable number. Or for example, Canada's been chairing the Peacebuilding Commission at the UN, so focusing much more on prevention. Or supporting Canada's Chief of Defence Staff in his leadership of the Women, Peace and Security Chief of Defence Staffs Network, which he's done just a tremendous job on. So we've done some of that, but very unfortunately, internationally, we've spent a lot of time defending this work from attacks that it's faced. And we can talk more about that, Beth, when we get to the focus on next year. But I would say, internationally, a lot of defensive position, while domestically we have made a good amount of progress, including having Minister Champagne, Minister of Foreign Affairs, announce several new commitments in October, like new funding for grassroots women's organization, new recognition for women, peace and security related research, and more. And then, of course, there was the pandemic. So layer that on top.
Just that small thing of the pandemic. I'm going to ask you about next year, but also before that, any surprises this year? Was there anything that other than the pandemic that that surprised you once you started in this position?
So I grew up in Alberta. I've been living in the US for the last 15 years working on this, and I say very honestly, it was a surprise to me to come back and see how pervasive attention to gender-based analysis and awareness about women, peace, and security is across key parts of our government. It's a predictable answer, but I'm really amazed every day at how many people I can talk to who are aware of the issue and are proactively trying to think about what they can do about it.
Okay, so
Especially in contrast to some previous experience.
A nice surprise then, no? La discussion aujourd'hui, c'est...
Today's discussion, of course, is about the year to come, the year ahead. We're already saying goodbye to 2020. And what do you think about next year? What will you work on the most? What will you focus on in your work? Okay, I'll answer in French and English. maybe, first of all, in English.
You know, looking ahead, of course, I'm trying to think about the last year. And I know everybody has a hot take on, you know, if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that, and then insert often what you believed already anyway. So I'm going to do a variation of that. But I would say that, you know, something that has really struck me in 2020 very clearly has been that this year has massively messed with the idea that we can somehow continue working in relative silos. So it has shown how dramatically interrelated so many things are. And as we just talked about in the last session, a health crisis is an economic crisis, is a consular crisis, is a security crisis, et cetera. And that concept was driven home in 2020 by a number of things. So one being the pandemic. And the second big aspect, I think, that defines 2020 has been the Black Lives Matter movement and attention, increased at least attention to systemic racism. And, you know, we hear a lot of people talk about lessons learned. I like to think about lessons observed, because we've observed them, but that doesn't mean our systems have reflected what we now know and what we've learned from them, and our institutions haven't changed as a result. So next year, this is all a lead up to the way of saying next year, I think of it as having a limited window to seize opportunities for real change created by both of those big dynamics. So, you know, this idea of moving from what did we learn in 2020 and how do we change our systems in 2021 and beyond means a few things. So one of them, of course, is reinforcing the value of making it just normal practice to track disaggregated data. So by gender, first of all, and I think, you know, we've talked about the ways that the pandemic has had really disproportionate impacts on women, 70% of frontline healthcare workers, majority of employees in retail and hospitality and other sectors, and major impacts on all parts of the economy, including, you know, all aspects when we talk about the fact that majority of women have had their ability to be at work affected by schools being canceled and kids being home from school. So that's one, disaggregated by gender, but then also disaggregated by other identity factors. So race, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, age, et cetera. And we really saw through the pandemic and with the light shone by Black Lives Matter, the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 even on different communities, including that people of color across Canada are more likely to get COVID-19. And of course, highlighting then that the idea that health outcomes for racialized Canadians are worse than white Canadians is true for a massive range of health conditions. So I think entrenching this focus on disaggregated data and making sure that we continue to collect it, in particular now that people across Canada are a little bit more aware, I think, and attuned to reading it in their day-to-day newspapers.
So you've just done a promo for the next session. So thank you
your diversity fireside chat. Good.
Yeah, great. So thanks. Sorry, but I didn't mean to interrupt you. I wanted to make sure we had time to hear about the international threats as well that you mentioned before.
I want to say really quickly, I can say very quickly en français, qu'une autre leçon apprise.
Another lesson learned is to value the members in our local organizations. And often local organizations are managed by women. And we have seen that multilateral organizations, large multilateral organizations, have not delivered the results, especially in the months at the beginning of the pandemic.
At local organizations and not simply projectizing the work that we're doing. And especially if we're talking about getting large groups of people to agree to take a vaccination, for example, we need the role in the leadership of local organizations, and in particular women-led organizations, who we saw be really instrumental in the first days of the pandemic, doing things like convincing people to wash hands, wear masks, stay home, et cetera. Sorry, Beth, I didn't want to forget our local organization.
Oh, very important. Very important. Thank you. Then internationally, the the threats to this agenda, the things that we're seeing of at the level of both language at the United Nations, the possibility of rolling back language, but also speaking of local organizations, we're seeing the threats to women human rights defenders, to LGBTQ rights defenders. We're seeing peace negotiations without women being involved. Could you talk a little bit about how you see that unrolling in 2021?
Yeah, so a big theme for 2021, I think, has to be what a great South African diplomat says, is pushing back on the pushback. So just a snapshot of the dynamics. We've seen a growth of xenophobic populism, which often comes with really regressive views on women's rights. That also comes with contesting a lot of international normative frameworks. And I think we're seeing, as you just mentioned, a growing number of states are questioning established standards and language that women from around the world have fought for decades. We're seeing a lot of, I guess, what I call strong men responses to the pandemic. So cracking down on all forms of assembly and free speech and minority rights in the name of keeping the country safe. We're seeing attacks on women's reproductive rights, including the US resurrection of the global gag rule. And we're seeing what people are calling the surfacing of a so-called gender ideology, which typically refers to a declared attempt to protect and value so-called traditional family structures, usually at the exclusion of LGBTQ+ lives. And having it framed by many people as more rights for more people means a direct threat to national values and acceptable way of life. And, we've seen this, you've seen this for a long time, especially Beth, having worked in Central Europe for a long time. The event I did this morning was with a group of people in the Czech Republic who are talking about dealing with and having to push back on this on a basically daily basis. And there are real implications for peace and security, and not least when, for example, the Colombian government and the FARC reached a peace deal in 2016. It went to a referendum among the Colombian people, and many in the Catholic Church, as well as other political leaders, campaigned against that peace agreement, saying that the provisions it had related to LGBTQ+ were a betrayal of traditional values and an expression of this so-called gender ideology. And those were provisions, just as a side note, that many women had introduced. And the referendum failed as a result. So it's very much related to all kinds of peace and security outcomes. So major focus on addressing that, and some key ways I look forward to doing that, and hopefully with many on this call. One is just supporting domestic feminist and women's rights movements. Always the best place people to move or to resist this are men and women, so feminists within their own countries. Second thing is not being swayed by misinformation. And Beth, you just mentioned the UN Security Council. Will spare this audience the gory details, but last month at the Security Council, Russia tried to introduce a resolution on women, peace, and security that basically no one really wanted. And predictably, it would have been a regression in language. And they wouldn't compromise during negotiations. And the Security Council was divided. And Russia tried to paint it as a kind of Western countries not respecting our women's definition of feminism. And that was completely unfounded. There were many, many African, Latin American, and other states pushing back against it very hard. It was not divided into regional blocs, despite that being the narrative. And the whole essence of women, peace, and security, the original resolutions came from women around the world, did not come from the so-called global north. So just pushing back on the narrative that this is a global north, global south thing is so essential. And in that spirit, really engaging allies. And in my office, we have a sort of a rule that says we never use the term like-minded country, because I think it sometimes results in a bit of stereotyping in some ways. And on this issue, there are people and countries and governments around the world that actually really want to step up and are stepping up in important ways. And Roland Paris said earlier about China, there's safety in numbers. There's safety in numbers on this too. And we need to make sure we continue to build alliances and make sure people feel good about being on the right side of this and not worried about it. Two other quick things, if I can, I just think is so important. So one is really continuing to be humble about our own shortcomings as Canada. We have to make sure that as we are talking internationally, we are also continuously recognizing what we have not done well enough at home. particularly related to Indigenous communities, acknowledging the systemic racism that exists within many of our institutions, and making sure that we are coming to this global discussion from a very humble perspective, but still showing up and still being very clear about the aspirations and the values that we have. And then the last way I think we can really collectively push back against the pushback is integrating thinking about this so deeply in all of our analysis that it can't just be easily stripped out. So a key way in Canada that we can keep doing that is introducing this type of thinking, the skills for this analysis into all of our training and education, making sure that students in universities are introduced to these concepts, that the way we train our diplomats, our military professionals, we're introducing these ideas, this how to do a gender-based plus analysis, what women, peace, and security is, different ways of analyzing conflict, different ways of doing all sorts of our professions earlier and earlier, so that someone, for example, as we saw in October, Russia can't just come and say, no, this is not important, we will not advance it, and then it disappears. We have to get its kind of tentacles in all aspects of everything that we do. Sorry, long answer, big challenge.
No, but it's going to be a long year, I think. So so thank you for that. I have one more question for Jackie, and we're hoping to take a couple of rounds of questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. And I think Stephanie's going to do some sifting for us, but we'll try to get a few questions into the ambassador before we wrap up in about 15 minutes. So my last formal question to you, Jackie, is you did throw out a bit of a challenge with your last comment to academics, to people involved in capacity building, to training, on the importance of bringing this analysis, bringing these insights into a multitude, the whole range, basically, of defense and security issues, as you illustrated at the beginning, some of the places where this is relevant. Do you have any other challenges or I guess challenges is one word, suggestions would be another, for the people on this call about how they can advance this agenda, be allies, or support this work?
I always do, Beth. Thank you. So yeah, so if you take anything away from this conversation, I hope it's that the concept of women, peace, and security is far more than just getting women into different roles. That's important. It's absolutely important because representation matters and people's diverse experiences matter, but that's not where it starts and stops. So I'd say if you are in a position of collecting data, you're doing research or you're in charge of collecting data, ask yourself, is it sufficiently disaggregated? Can I go even further in running, in collecting and disaggregating my data and then running it in different ways and just looking at what you find? Are you finding differences? If you're a researcher, please review your research questions and think about, are there additional dimensions you could examine? You don't need to entirely reorient research, but think, are there additional sub-questions that I can examine? And maybe if it's not obvious, a workshop with some colleagues, obviously not only women, but others who might think that through. If you're teaching, do an audit of your reading lists or your curricula. So, is there any analysis related to gender perspective, gender-based analysis plus women, peace, and security, et cetera? So that's one. But even just how many male authors, how many female authors, how many authors are people of color, how many women of color, and let people around you know if you need more help finding interesting and relevant and substantive readings to include in your curricula. And even teach your students how to do a basic gender-based analysis plus. There's good resources on the Women and Gender Equality WAGE website. But you could go online, figure it out, and do it together. I think demystifying, taking a basic issue and demystifying it together with students really just sparks a different way of thinking that serves people really well over time. Two last things I'd say is one, really seek out diverse voices in your own social media feeds or other ways that you curate information. So I've really challenged myself in the last few years to follow as many Black and Indigenous voices as I can, see who they follow, start following them, et cetera, and make sure that I'm getting a broader perspective than I was before. And finally, last thing I'd say, and Beth, you can maybe add to this, but the government is producing, with coordination and input from civil society, a white paper on our feminist foreign policy. So really trying to define what that means. And I'd say, read it when it comes out, engage with it, especially if you're teaching or researching, discuss it with your students, see if people have input, feedback, reactions. I mean, I want to hear it, but I also want people to, not dismiss the concept as something that the government's doing to, whatever the term is, virtue signal or whatever else it is, but how does it really, what are the really meaty aspects and the ways that this could affect your area, your field, your specialization, and do let us know. So please stay in touch and keep feeding back into us as government your experiences so that we keep refining our understanding as well. My list.
Thank you, Jackie. Very concrete, very practical, very specific. I hope that that people were taking notes and that maybe we start to see some of these issues bubbling through curriculum and seeing new graduates with the skills and asking the questions that you've been raising. There was one question in the, or maybe we'll try to do a couple questions at once. One, I asked you about any surprises that you've had since you were named ambassador. There's a question about what your biggest obstacle was and how did you overcome it? And then there's another question that is asking for more, or maybe a couple concrete examples, like you mentioned equipment not suiting women. The person in the chat talks about how Guelph is starting to plow their sidewalks for snow removal before the streets as one, after doing a gender analysis of who uses streets and who uses sidewalks. Maybe if you could give us a couple of examples of when this analysis has been done, what changes? Because we know we don't just do the analysis and have it sit on the shelf, but then what changes resulted and what are some of the implications that we're learning in that area?
Sure. Okay, I'll start with the second one. And I love that example because, talking with people around the world, we say, what's one issue that, certainly has no gender dimensions? And snow removal. So who knew that snow removal had a gender dimension? Many more women take public transportation and or walk to get to work than men. So if you're, clearing primarily main streets, sometimes in some cases that can have a disproportional effect on men or on women. So great example. Another one that that I would share would be the RCMP did. They were looking at their promotion from within process and identified that they were having challenges getting women to apply for promotions within the RCMP. And one of the things that was identified, and this is a fairly technical thing, but just to show it's not all structural changes that have to be involved, even though there are structural changes to address. They did a gender-based analysis plus on the promotion process. And they found that a big barrier was the fact that people had to apply for this promotion in the month of September. So if you're in particular a parent with young children, the month of September usually is about the worst month of all time to have to do anything other than get kids prepared and out the door to school. So they made it a rolling process and extended it for a year. And I think applications by women increased by something like 18%. So again, very technical, very narrow results that doesn't speak to broader systemic issues, but can often just result in a very, very small change that leads to a significant increase or change that you want to see. The other thing on obstacles, I'd say this is less so within Canada, but internationally, we are definitely at a phase where most people are well conditioned about the words that they should say on this topic, sort of on what is politically acceptable and desired in terms of expressions of support for the women, peace, and security agenda, et cetera, et cetera. And so a challenge has been adapting our ways of measuring the sincerity of someone's commitment. So, for example, being much more attentive to plans that are released or plans that are made but have no resources assigned to them, no budget, no human, staff time assigned to it. People bringing in gender-based analysis plus or bringing in any type of consultation near the very, very end of their process. Or people who will send something to a committee. This happens often at the UN, where it's kind of sure to die a slow death. So yes, we'll study it, we'll get it in this committee where almost nothing ever comes out, but it's definitely a priority. Or having just one-off events. I think we've seen a few times where people say, we had a conference last year on this issue, and so we're very committed, but there's never been an internal conversation within the organization. So a challenge has been kind of adapting the way that we advocate, or that not just the arguments that we make, but the ways that we figure out where people's commitment levels actually stand in order to calibrate the types of support or advocacy that we might want to give them.
Interesting. I've seen different analysis on resistance and how it can take different forms. Mm-hmm. And one of the most insidious forms to try to deal with is this one thing to your face and another thing behind the scenes in terms of stalling. We have a few minutes to have time for another couple of questions. And I'm not sure if we want to show the video, so I'll wait for a signal on that. Another question, Jackie, picks up on your reference of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and that women have been on the front lines. And are there takeaways or lessons that governments can use as we roll out the vaccine because of this? So again, how do we move from the analysis to the action, and any lessons we're learning on strengthening that path? And I guess you mentioned it too, this idea that lessons observed are different than lessons learned.
Yeah. And, I think we're still trying to learn a lot of lessons, as you referenced, Beth, from Ebola and from other crises as well. I mean, Ebola, 75% of the people who died from Ebola were women. And again, that was many of them are because they were responsible for caring for sick people and for dead bodies and burial responsibilities. So, so some lessons or some insights, I mean, what we saw very clearly especially at the start of the pandemic, and Beth, you saw this in spades, is many organizations pivoting to be effectively frontline service providers or provide, pandemic response type messaging. In particular, among Rohingya in the Rakhine state, when internet was often shut off, they were some of the sole people who were trying to calm people, trying to make sure that misinformation was not spreading. So local voices, essential roles in preventing misinformation from spreading. And again, if we think that we can have a global vaccine distribution without real moral authority and real leaders within communities, which are very often not in formal positions of authority, but are found in locally led women's organizations, not being able to share information or support different types of vaccine distribution or give insights on how to most equitably distribute those vaccines, then we're going to have all kinds of problems. So really, really, the lesson is listening to the local and building that into planning, not just as kind of recipients of vaccine or vaccine distribution strategies. Beth, you're muted.
Sorry about that. When you were appointed in the middle of last year, there was a lot of applause from Canadian civil society organizations who were very, very pleased to see someone of your caliber, someone with your commitment, someone with your background take up this position. And I must say that in this conversation today and in your actions over the last year and a half, you have not disappointed. We are very pleased to have you as our ambassador, have you represent Canada both internally and around the world. And we look forward to all that will be accomplished in the rest of your term. So thank you for today, and thank you for all the work that you do. And back to you, Steve.
Beth and Ambassador O'Neill, I really want to thank you. That was a really helpful conversation. I think, Beth, that we may end up making you the permanent moderator for all future CDSN and CSIDS events, because you really made it a very nice conversation that that allowed Jackie to talk to us without feeling as if she was talking, talking with us as opposed to talking to us. And I know that's something that she wanted to have happen today because she gets plenty of opportunities just to speechify. And so she wanted something a little more interactive. And so that was perfect. That was terrific. And Ambassador O'Neill, I really appreciate your time. I know you're very, very busy reaching out both internally and externally on these issues. I think that we academics and those in the WPS sphere know kind of what this stuff is, but I think that you helped people who are less familiar understand it, and you helped those of us who are more familiar really appreciate the dimensions. It's funny that you use snow removal because I always tend to use that as a way to compare understanding militaries versus understanding other government agencies, because effectiveness is really hard to measure in many things. But in snow removal, the enemy is usually not trying to outthink you. But in this case, I really hadn't thought about this. I usually just grumble about my own snow removal problems. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back with a fireside chat, which will luckily have Beth again moderating the conversation. It should be a really interesting conversation that will follow up nicely from the table that Ambassador O'Neill has set for us. So we'll see you in 15 minutes. If this was a real live event, we'd be providing you with coffee and cookies at this point. Sorry, we can't do that this time. See you again in 15 minutes.
Thanks so much.
It's my pleasure